All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us on Zoom tonight. We at Syracuse are happy to meet all of you and excited that you are interested in meeting us and learning a bit tonight. My name is Rachel Skipper. I'm our Associate Director of Undergraduate and of Graduate Recruitment in the College of Arts and Sciences and the Maxwell School. So I am just really going to kick off today's session and then leave it to the true star of the show today, who is a Syracuse professor, as you know. So the goal of today's session is for you to really just be able to learn from one of our professors, to meet some of your peers who share your interest in philosophy or friendship or ethics or both, and ideally to learn something, right? So this should be a relaxed session and a fun thing for all of us. I will kick off by saying that our professor leading class today is Erica Shumener. She is a professor in our Department of Philosophy at Syracuse, which is a really large and popular department within the College of Arts and Sciences at the university. So she's a great person to ask if you're interested in majoring in a major like philosophy or ethics. Taking courses, you would have the option to take classes from here in the future if that's something you're interested in. And of course, to ask about topics around friendship and ethics behind friendship. And I'm sure she will give you many more things that you might want to ask about moving forward. I'll point you to the chat if you have any questions for us. If you have questions for Professor Shumener, just leave them there in the chat and we will kind of see those as they come in, or we have allocated some time at the end of the session for Q&A. So I encourage you to be interactive either on camera or on mic if you're comfortable. At minimum in the chat, please interact with us throughout the session. Let us know what you're thinking, what your questions are. And with that, I'll leave it to Professor Shumener.
Thanks so much, Rachel. It's so great to see everybody. I'm really excited to be here and hopefully to meet all of you and hopefully to see you soon in person. I am going to put a handout in the chat. You don't need to open that link right now. That's really going to be for later. The first thing I wanted to do, so as Rachel said, I'm a professor here at Syracuse University. This is my third year here. My blood runs orange now. I love it here. And what I wanted to do first is I know that not all high school students are familiar with philosophy classes. Philosophy is not offered in all high schools, and I know I didn't take a philosophy class in high school. So I thought I'd say a little bit about what philosophy is and how it works at SU before discussing the topic for today. Right, so first, philosophy at Syracuse. So we've got a major here, the philosophy major. This is our faculty. This is a picture. I'm over in the right. Way better lighting that day than today. And our philosophy major is such that you can take classes in just a huge variety of subjects. So for example, you can take classes in the history of philosophy where you would learn where, say, what Socrates said, or what Plato said, or what Aristotle said in ancient Greek philosophy. You could take classical Islamic philosophy. You could take Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche, etc. There are other topics as well. So in particular, ethics is a huge topic here, right? And we can take, and ethics falls under what we call value theory. And so you can take classes in contemporary ethics, philosophy of law, medical ethics, reproductive ethics, especially for focusing on issues, say, about the morality of abortion, and a huge variety of topics, including also political philosophy. Right? There are also topics in metaphysics, philosophy of religion, free will, philosophy of mind, logic, and philosophy of science. That's a whole variety of stuff. I myself work in metaphysics, which are questions about what exists. Is there a God? Is there not? Do we have free will? Do we not? Can we survive, say, having our consciousness uploaded in an AI? Is that something that would inherently kill us or not? I'm interested in questions like that. I teach classes on questions like that. You can make a career out of that. And then many other topics as well. So feminist philosophy, philosophy of race and identity, bioethics, philosophy of art. So this is just a small sampling of the kinds of classes we have here, and you'd find in our philosophy department. Now we offer a variety of degree programs at SU. So there's the normal philosophy BA, but you could also major in political philosophy, which is what a lot of people interested in law school choose to do, or an ethics BA, where you focus solely on ethical issues. You can also minor in philosophy, say if you want to major in something else, and then you can also minor in logic and cognitive science, which have a lot of overlap. So sometimes people make fun of philosophy. They don't think it's that useful of a discipline. And so I have some memes up here, right? So one is of the young lady who says, "Dad, I've decided to major in philosophy." And he responds, "That's great because they just opened a huge philosophy factory in our town." So obviously there are no philosophy factories. But philosophy, nevertheless, is a very useful discipline. And it is one that you will find I'll find many people who go to law school, for example, have majored in philosophy. Philosophy is the highest scoring humanities subject area for LSAT scores, and one of the highest, if not the highest, for GRE and GMAT scores. So philosophy really primes you well, I think, to going into law school, business school, other graduate fields of study. And moreover, I think philosophy is just inherently worthwhile. I think for figuring out one's place in the world, for figuring out how you want to treat others, how you want to understand the world around you. So I think philosophy is hugely interesting and important. And I just wanted to include a quote by current Senator Marco Rubio. Right, so he got into trouble with the philosophy world in 2015 for saying, "Welders make more money than philosophers, and we need more welders and less philosophers." So even Marco Rubio saw the error of his ways. Years later, he said, "Oh, I made fun of philosophy 3 years ago, but when I was challenged to study it, I started reading the Stoics, and that changed my views. And now he thinks there needs to be both philosophers and welders." Moreover, philosophers actually are pretty high earners for mid-career earners among humanities fields. So it's not true all the time that philosophers are earning less than their peers. Okay. So here's just some data I have. Mid-career salaries of non-STEM majors. This was 2015, so this needs to be updated. But as you can see, philosophy is pretty high up there, higher even than business economics and marketing. And if you're planning to go to law school, philosophy is a great area. They have the second highest scoring LSAT philosophy majors, LSAT scores in 2022, only second to economics. All right, so that's just a little bit of background about philosophy, how it can be useful, the types of classes you could take at SU, and if you have any questions about the philosophy major or about what philosophy is in general, please, I'll have a few minutes at the end and I'll ask you if you want to ask any of those. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my sharing because I want to move on to the topic for today. Okay, hi everybody. So I put the handout in the chat. This is the handout I'm going to go with. I'm going to repost it. I'm just posting it a few times in case there are some latecomers. So, okay, what I wanted to do for today, I was kind of thinking, oh, what would be a good topic? And I thought it would be a good idea to talk about a philosophical issue that doesn't require a lot of background reading or background studying. So you can kind of get the sense of what we would discuss in a philosophy class without having to actually do any more homework. Because I know all of you are probably super busy with all of your classes. So, okay. So as I said in my spiel a couple minutes ago, philosophy really concerns so many different questions, right? It can range from questions like, is democracy the right form of government, to questions of whether abortion is permissible, to whether God exists, right? So today what I've chosen is a more localized topic, a more personal topic that philosophers are interested in, which is questions about how to be a good friend, right? So this is, I think, important probably to all of us, right? We all are friends, we all have friends, and we all want our friends to be good friends to us, and we want to be good friends to them. That's really important, right? And so we want to be a good friend, but that's not the only thing we want to be in life, right? We don't just want to be good friends, we want to achieve other goals. And one goal that philosophers often focus on is we want to be rational thinkers, right? We want to be people who respond to our evidence and believe things on the basis of our evidence. We don't want to form beliefs irresponsibly. So, okay, so the way that these philosophers are thinking of it is like we have two goals. We have more goals than two, but we're focusing on these two goals. One, we want to be a good friend. And two, we want to be rational people who form our beliefs on the basis of evidence, not on the basis of prejudice, not on the basis of our whims, but on evidence, right? And for a long time, people thought these are just two goals, and they don't really have much to do with one another. They're just two different principles we live our lives by. But what this one philosopher, this one contemporary philosopher named Simon Keller did, is he discovered a puzzle between these two goals we have. So he thinks sometimes there can be a conflict between being a good friend and being a rational believer, being somebody who responds to their evidence. So what we're going to look at today is how Keller thinks this conflict arises between being a good friend and being a rational believer, and see potential solutions to this conflict. So if I were you, now would be a good time to open up that handout, because that's where we're at right now. And that might help you follow along. And I'll take some breaks to ask you questions in a couple minutes. So, okay. So here's what Keller says. When good friends form beliefs about each other, they sometimes respond to considerations that have to do with the needs and interests of their friends, not with aiming at the truth. And that's what makes them good friends. So as we're going to see, this thought from Keller is what leads him to a kind of puzzle. But first, we need a little bit of setup of the puzzle, right? So here is how the setup is going to work. And I'm sorry for that dinging. I think that's me. Okay, so here's how we're going to set up this puzzle, right? First of all, Keller introduces what he calls norms of friendship, right? These are kinds of principles of being a good friend. Can any of you think of what are some principles of being a good friend? So here's one I can think of, right? To be a good friend, you gotta pick up your friend when their car breaks down. That's a good principle of friendship. Can you guys think of just any other ways of being a good friend? Principles of being a good friend? You can even unmute yourselves and say it or put it in the chat, whatever you want. Be honest at all times. Okay, good. That's a great one. I'm so glad you say that. Well, that one's going to come up in a second, right? Be trustworthy. Excellent. Yeah, those are great, right? Be honest at all times. Provide a lending ear. Loyalty. Perfect. Listening. Being reliable. Exactly. Those are great principles of friendship. Being respectful. Having great support system. These are amazing, right? So these are all principles of being a good friend, right? What Keller calls those are norms of friendship. Okay, so just keep that in mind for a second, right? There are also what he calls epistemic norms. So epistemic norms are truths or principles about what you should do insofar as you're a person who forms and holds belief. So basically, epistemic norms are norms that tell you what you should believe, how you should form your belief, right? And those are less familiar than friendship norms. But let me give you some example of epistemic norms, right? You should believe things for which there is overwhelming evidence, right? So for example, you should believe that water is composed of H2O particles because there's overwhelming evidence of that, right? So one epistemic norm is you should believe for things for which there's overwhelming evidence. Another is that you shouldn't believe something just because you think believing it will make you rich, right? That's not a responsible way to form belief, right? Okay. So now we've got these two different principles or truths, right? We've got these epistemic norms and these friendship norms. So far, there's no problem yet, but these are just truths or principles that govern how we live our lives. Now I want to tell you about how the conflict between being a good friend and being a rational believer is supposed to arise. First, I just want you to consider a thought experiment. Philosophers love thought experiments, hypothetical thought experiments. So imagine that you're a juror on a jury, right? And it's a criminal trial, it's a murder trial, even, right? And you've been asked to judge the case of Paula. Now, Paula has been accused of murder, and you've been presented with overwhelming evidence that she's guilty. You have the fingerprints, you have video footage, you have eyewitness testimony, you have things that you have other DNA, right? And experts say that given the evidence, there's a 99% chance that she committed the murder. Even though from the testimony of her friends and family, it seems like Paula is a good person. So this is surprising. So you're kind of, when you're watching the case, you're like, wow, it's kind of shocking that Paula would do this, but the evidence is overwhelming. We have all kinds of physical and secondhand evidence, right? So how many of you would vote to convict Paula? Raise your hands. All right. How many of you would think she's innocent still? Not too many of us, right? If we were in this situation, of course, this is a very difficult situation to be in, and we'd have to trust the justice system is acting properly. But if we really had this kind of evidence that it's 99%, all the experts say, hey, look, given this overwhelming evidence, it's quite likely that she did it, right? Most of us would think, okay, well, it does seem like it's beyond a reasonable doubt. I think I'm forced rationally to believe she did it, right? Okay. But now consider that instead of Paula being on trial, it's your best friend, right? It's your absolute best friend. And now she or he or they have been accused of murder. And the evidence, again, is overwhelmingly likely. How many experts say there too, in this exact case, right? There's a 99% chance that your friend did it. Let's call your friend Anna, right? How many of you would believe that Anna is guilty? Okay, good. I'm glad, Catalina, there's somebody. Okay, so as you can see, though, there's a lot more people who are inclined to make the same judgment about their friend as they would be about the stranger, right? And so at this moment, you might be thinking like, oh yeah, that's because my friend is my friend. Like, I know she wouldn't do this, right? The stranger, you don't know Paula, right? Maybe she would do this. But what's interesting is by the setup of the case, right, there's the same evidence for the both of them. So rationally speaking, it seems like either you should not judge either of them to be guilty, or you should judge both of them are guilty, right? But if you were to believe that your best friend was guilty, then it seems like we may have a conflict with our norms of friendship, because part of what it is to be a good friend, and we saw this in the chat, is people think you should be loyal, you should be supportive, you should believe in your friends. If you believe that your friend is guilty in this case, it seems like you might not be being a good friend, though you're being rational. And instead, if you choose to believe your friend is innocent in the face of all that evidence, then in that case, you might be being a good friend, but you're not being rational, because you saw that the same amount of evidence in the case of Paula causes you to think that Paula was guilty, right? So now the conflict should be starting to arise. The idea is, on the one hand, you could believe in your friend no matter what. You just ride or die for your friend. You're like, anyone asks you, you're like, Anna's innocent. I don't care what evidence was found at the scene. I know Anna, she's my BFF, no way, right? If you do that, you're not acting rationally, it looks like. You're not respecting certain epistemic norms. If you go the other way, you say, okay, Anna's just like Paula. I see that from a bird's eye view, same evidence against them. So I guess Anna must be guilty. Now you're not being loyal. You're not believing the best in your friend. So you've got a violation of your friendship norm. So this is supposed to be the conflict between norms of friendship and epistemic norms. Now, you might think to yourself, this is a very extreme case, right? You're like, how does this apply to me in real life? My friend is never going to be on trial for murder, right? And hopefully that's true, right? I hope none of your friends are ever on trial for murder. And I hope nothing like that ever happens, right? Nevertheless, what Keller says, right, is that actually this is more, this kind of phenomenon, a conflict between being a good friend and being a rational believer, is way more commonplace, way more typical than you might have thought. So let me tell you what that is, and then let me try to get your thoughts on this, right? So here, second case, imagine this. Now nobody's on trial, you're a barista at a coffee shop. And say that this coffee shop is one where people read their poetry every Friday night. It has kind of like a poetry hour for amateur poets. And say you've been a barista there for 2 years, and every Friday there's been a poetry reading, and every Friday that poetry has sucked. It's just been the worst poetry you've ever heard, right? And so you've come to form the belief like, okay, for every poet, every Friday, they're bad, because for the last 2 years, they've been terrible. And so the next one will probably be terrible too. My boss just has terrible taste when they pick amateur poets, right? So, okay, so now if I were to ask you, what do you think about the next poet who comes along on Friday? Are they going to be good or bad? you're going to think they're most likely going to be bad because they've been bad so far. But now imagine your best friend comes to you, right? You didn't realize this. I think the best friend here is Rebecca. So Rebecca comes to you, unbeknownst to you, she's been working on poetry secretly for years, right? And Rebecca's so excited. She's like, I've just been booked to give a poetry reading at your cafe on Friday, right? Now, what should you believe? Should you believe that Rebecca's poetry is going to suck? Or should you believe that Rebecca is going to do great, that she's going to have a great, amazing reading full of interesting topics, right? Or interesting poems, right? Here again, we have the same exact conflict, though with lower stakes than the murder trial. If you're being rational, you should think, well, every poet that has come to the cafe has been terrible out of hundreds of poets, so Rebecca's going to be terrible too. But as a good friend, you should believe in your friend. You should believe that they can do what they set out to do, that they're talented, right? You know, Rebecca's been working hard at this for years. She just told you that you should believe in your friend. Again, if you don't believe in your friend, it seems like you're being a bad friend. You're not being loyal in the right way. If you don't believe in your, if you do believe in your friend, then it seems like you're not being rational, right? You're not responding to your evidence. You know all the poets have been bad so far, right? There's nothing really that should make Rebecca special. So, okay, so that's where we stand right now. We've got these norms, these principles that guide our forming rational beliefs, and they seem to conflict in certain scenarios with our norms and principles of being a good friend. Now, I would love to hear from you. And this is how a philosophy class would actually go at Syracuse. I would take a break right now, which is what I'm going to do. Take a break from just talking at you. And I want to just hear your reaction. And your reaction, no matter what it is it going to be a good jumping off point, right? The way we do philosophy is we hear about these different kinds of cases and we try to figure out what our initial reaction to them is, right? So let me just ask you, and I would love if you speak up, but you don't have to if you feel uncomfortable, of course, but I'd love if you speak up. But say in the case of Rebecca and the poetry reading, would you form the belief that she will be good? Or would you form the belief that she's probably not going to be any good? Yeah, Catalina, please.
I think she would be good. I don't know. I would trust my friend in that situation because I don't know, I would believe in my friend, but if it was someone else, I don't think I would believe in them. So there is that conflict there.
Good, good. So you're like, okay, I see the conflict between being rational and being a good friend, and I'm just going to be a good friend. You're like, that's what's more important in this situation. All right, great. Catherine, yes, what do you think?
I feel like I have the opposite belief. Like I feel like even though she tells me she's a good poet, like I'd have to see it to believe it. Like I have a friend, actually, I have lived through this. I have a friend who's like, yeah, I'm a really good poet. And I read one of her poems. I was like, oh, this is not good. But like, but like, I think that I wouldn't believe her just because she's my friend. I'd have to see it and then like give the assessment from there.
Excellent, excellent. So this is, I'm so glad that both of you had these reactions because they're kind of opposite reactions, right? And they're getting at the conflict, right? So what you're thinking is you're leaning towards the epistemic norm, keeping that intact. You're like, hey, look, if I think about it, what should make my friend any different from these hundreds of terrible poets? So I can't rationally believe that she's going to be good. You're like, I could support her maybe, I could cheer her on, but I'd have to actually get proof that she's good before I could believe in her in this way. All right, good. So a couple more people. Hadar. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
It's Hadar, yeah.
Hadar. I'm sorry, Hadar.
You're good. I think if she was my friend, I'd probably hear it before she performed, just because we would be friends. But if she wouldn't let me do that, I think I'd support her in every way to do it. But I'd probably assume she'd be bad if for 2 years, for every single Friday, everyone was bad. I think I would think she would be also, but I would still like be proud of her for doing it.
Great. So I'm so glad you wrote that. That is exactly where I wanted to lead to next, right? So that's a great point for the transition. And that's what I think a lot of our not everybody's, but a lot of our intuitive responses is like, oh, okay. The evidence says she's not going to be good. So I have to form the belief that she's probably not going to be good. But to be a good friend, she doesn't need to know about my beliefs. I'm just going to support her and be like, Rebecca, you're going to do great. I believe in you. And tell her those things, even though secretly I believe that she's not going to do that. Now, Keller thinks this is a problematic response. Can anybody kind of see why some people might have a problem with this response? That's not to say it's not a good response. It's a very good response. That's exactly what occurred to me too, right? But I'm thinking like Keller himself wants to ultimately reject that response. So let me repeat what that is, right? He's going to say, you might think you can get around the conflict by secretly believing she's not going to do well, but telling her that she will and supporting her. What could be an issue there, Nicole?
I would say that the issue would probably be that then you'd technically be lying to your friend. So then in that way, you're not being a good friend because you're not being truthful.
Exactly. The problem there, Keller thinks, is that you'd be violating a different friendship norm, right? So you think you're avoiding the conflict because your beliefs are rational, but you're acting loyally. But actually, there's another friendship norm that lots of people put in the chat of being honest with your friends, right? So if you were to do this, you'd be lying to your friend, right? Telling them something you don't believe. And a lot of us think like, oh, I shouldn't outright lie to my friend just so her feelings aren't hurt. Right? So what Keller thinks is that we haven't yet found a way around the conflict. All right. Did anyone else want to, I'm sorry, I think I may have missed a hand. All right. Maya, was that a hand? No? All right, I'm sorry. Okay. So great. So one thing I wanted to call your attention to, right, is, okay, so now we have the conflict and we don't yet have a solution. We've had some people tell us what they would do, right? They're like, I would preserve the friendship and I wouldn't be rational in this situation. Other people said, I'd be rational. And if it means being a bad friend in that scenario, that's okay, right? I guess I got to do that, right? But we've seen how there doesn't seem to be a way to preserve both of these norms acting at the same time. And that's a conflict for us, right? Okay. So now if this were a class in the middle of the semester, and this is a class I do teach in my intro honors class, right? What we would do next is we would examine an argument, right? So philosophers are really interested in how to structure arguments, how to analyze arguments, and how to build our own arguments. And I think this is one of the hallmarks of critical thinking, right? Being able to understand your opponent's argument, especially your opponents, as well as your friends' arguments. Because if you can understand the structure of an argument, you can help pinpoint where its weaknesses are, if it has any weaknesses. And the better you get at that, the better you get at making your own arguments, right? And arguments are, for philosophers, just like the best thing you could have, because arguments try to persuade people rationally on the basis of reasons, not on the basis of emotions or biases, right? So I just say this because at this point, what I would do, and I do have this on the handout, is I would go through what's called an argument reconstruction, filling out how Keller's argument is supposed to work. And by doing that, then we can pinpoint where we would want to reject the premises of his argument. So I do have this on the handout, and I'll just call your attention to it. It's on page 2 of the handout. All right, well, whatever. Okay, it's on page 2 of the handout, and it is, this is the structure of his argument, right? If our epistemic norms conflict with our friendship norms, then there are situations where we either are forced to be a bad friend or we are forced to have irrational beliefs. That's one premise. The second premise is there are real life situations, oh, I forgot an S. There are real life situations in which our epistemic norms conflict with our friendship norms. So there are real world scenarios where these two norms conflict. Therefore, there are situations where we are either forced to be a bad friend or to have irrational beliefs. Okay. So that's the structure of the argument. And so now if we're interested in rejecting the conclusion, thinking like, hey, no, I can live my life while being a rational believer and being a good friend, what we need to do is we need to find ways to reject one of the premises of that argument. And so that's the way that philosophers like to kind of cleanly, rigorously capture somebody's reasoning and try to pinpoint where it goes wrong. So in any philosophy class, you will be presented with arguments and asked to construct your own arguments and being asked to support, either defend or object to various premises. That's just a little bit of background of what happens in a philosophy class. Okay. So I want to go through some potential responses, some potential ways of rejecting one, thinking that of rejecting two, believing that there are real situations where epistemic norms conflict with friendship norms. So maybe these two norms don't really conflict. We've already seen one way to try to get at that response. One way to try to get at that response is to say, oh, we should just lie to our friends. But then we saw that that leads to a violation of a different friendship norm. So now I want to look at some other objections. So we already did objection 1, right? Now on the handout for page 2, this is now objection 2. Here's another thing that Keller considers as a response to this conflict. Maybe being a good friend is a kind of role or guise we adopt. It's a kind of role, right? And when we're actively playing the role, say at the poetry reading or before the poetry reading, we should believe in our friends. So we should believe that Rebecca will succeed. But when we are not under that guise, we should believe that she will probably fail, right? So there's no conflict here. We follow the friendship norms when we have our friend role on. And then we don't follow the friendship norms when we don't have our friend role on. So in a way, adopting a friend role is kind of like adopting another kind of role, like a job almost. Like you adopt your barista role when you go to work. You adopt your student role when you do your homework. Another way to get around this conflict, Keller considers, right, is like, hey, maybe being a friend is like that. When we're around Rebecca and she asks us whether she's going to be good at the poetry reading, well, then we put our friendship role on and we tell her she's going to be great, right? But then when she leaves, we get rid of our friendship role, just like when we get off of work, right? And now I have back on my rational believer role. And my rational believer role follows epistemic norms and thinks she's not going to be good at all. But there's no conflict because here, the idea is I am going to be a rational believer when I don't play the friendship role. And when I am playing the friendship role, I'm going to be a good friend. What do we think? Is that a good response to this conflict, do you think? To think of friendship as like a role that we play? Why not? Why isn't it good to think of friendship like a role? Why would it be bad to think of friendship like a role?
I think that's just being two-faced in a way, because I don't know how to explain it, but I think you're not really being a true friend if you're telling someone what they want to hear. At the end, you should tell your friends like the truth, because a lot of times it just backfires. Like, oh, I've had situations where I tell a friend like this thing and like, oh, why'd you tell me this? Like, oh, I did so horrible in this because of you. It's like you tell them what they want to hear, but then it backfires a lot of times. So
good, excellent. Yes, Emma, that I was exactly thinking that too. Yes, Emma. Yeah.
I was gonna say something similar too. It's just the fact that not being true to the person is exhausting on your end, but also could be exhausting on their end, if that makes sense. And that you're not being genuine with that.
Good. Exactly. So here too, kind of like with the first way of getting around the conflict, here it seems like, are you being a good friend? If you treat friendship as like a role that you can kind of take on and take off at various points, a lot of us think, no, it feels like we're being disingenuous. We're going to say one thing and believe one thing in one context, and then believe something else in another context. Nicole, did you want to add to this? No? All right. I'm sorry. All right. All right. Good. So yes. So exactly, right? A lot of us think like, well, friendship norms don't work like that. It's not like we can choose when to be a friend, right? Part of what it is to be a friend is like, you're a friend all the time, right? Like being a friend requires a kind of 24/7 commitment. That of course doesn't mean you've got to, answer all your friends' calls at 3 a.m. or something like that. But it does mean that even if you were to wake you up in the middle of the night, you're a friend then. And even if you're not thinking about your friend, you're busy at work, you're a friend then, right? So a lot of people, especially Keller, right, thinks this also isn't a good response to the conflict because it gives up a kind of hallmark feature of friendship, that friendship is a 24/7 vibe. This is maybe the way to put it. Okay. All right, great, great. Okay. So now he considers one last objection, right, to his argument, right? So here, one objection is like, hey, maybe our friendship norms and our epistemic norms don't conflict. Why? Maybe the fact that somebody is a good friend of ours is evidence, rational evidence that they're going to be good at something. So maybe the fact that Rebecca is our friend gives us evidence that she's going to be a good poet. Or maybe the evidence that Anna is our friend should make us think that she's not a murderer. We're thinking we wouldn't be friends with super untalented people. We wouldn't be friends with murderers. So maybe the fact that we are friends with Anna and Rebecca in these two situations gives us evidence of their talent or their innocence, right? So if that were true, we wouldn't have a conflict either, because if our friendship gives us evidence that the person is talented or innocent, then we don't have any conflict with our evidence, right? Our evidence is going to be pointing to believing in Anna's innocence. And it's also going to be pointing to believing in Rebecca's talent. What do we think about this response? Is that a good response to get out of the conflict? Yes, Hadar.
Wouldn't that be like a personal bias if you think that they're good just because they're your friend?
Yes, exactly. So yes, Nicole.
I was kind of gonna say the same thing in a way, like, isn't it's kind of like subjective, like maybe you're like, well, they're my friends, so I think that it's good. But if you look at it from like an outside perspective, is it really actually like that good?
Good, good. Yeah. So you're thinking, well, why should the fact that they're my friend really provide this kind of evidence, right? Like, isn't that a kind of bias? We are kind of prejudiced towards our friends, but that's not rational, right? So that's the thought. Okay, good. Yes, and I see some agreement in the chat. So I think that's totally right. And I think that in some of the harder cases, we can really see the problems with going in this direction. So say your friend is accused of some kind of crime that has led innocent people to suffer, right? A lot of us would think like, okay, of course we want to believe that she's innocent on the basis of her being our friend, but if other people have really been hurt by some actions, right? If other people are real victims in this situation, we need to be responsible towards them too, we think, right? And we think it might not be totally being responsible to them if we trust our friend just because she's our friend, right? It seems like, are we treating those other people in the environment fairly? Right? This is a special kind of extra aspect of these cases that becomes relevant in cases where, say, a friend is accused of harming others, right? So if we really just believed in somebody's innocence or somebody's talent just because they're our friend, it seems like, well, in cases where believing, say, in their innocence might lead to extra harm to others in the environment, we can kind of see the rational conflict even more clearly. That's the thought. So Keller thinks that this is not a good response to the conflict either. It's not that the fact that this person is our friend should give us a reason to think that they're going to be innocent or that they're going to be talented. So where does this leave us? Now, in a philosophy class, in the way a philosophy class would go, I would have this be the jumping off point for you guys to tell me what you think should be the response, how we should resolve the conflict, or whether we can resolve the conflict at all, right? And one thing I would do is maybe this would be a topic for class discussion or a short paper or something like that. And I want to hear what you think, right? And for those of you who think that there remains a conflict, that the conflict really can't be resolved, which norm is going to be more important in which scenario, right? Now, in this kind of class, this is the first time a lot of you have heard about this conflict, have really reasoned about this conflict, so that it's going to be too difficult. Now, I'll just tell you Keller's own version of the solution. I'll also put my cards on the table. I don't think his solution is that satisfying. I actually kind of think his discussion of the conflict is more persuasive than his discussion of the solution. So I'm interested in what you think, right? So, okay, here's his own solution, right? His solution is that there is a genuine conflict, and what we need to do is just figure out for ourselves in what situations it's more important to be a good friend, and in what situations it's more important to be rational, right? And he thinks that we should decide somehow for ourselves, by each one of us for ourselves, which situations are going to be governed by which norms, right? So here's one way to do it, for example, right? You might think, well, okay, if it turns out, if it's a case like Rebecca, in a case like we're going to a she's going to do a coffee shop reading, right? Nobody is going to be harmed by my believing in my friend Rebecca in this case. So in that kind of case, I am going to believe in Rebecca. I'm going to believe that she's going to do well, because here the friendship norm is more important to me than the epistemic norm. But maybe in the Anna and Paula case, where my friend's being accused of murder and other people are involved, other people have potentially been hurt by my friend's actions, and I need to respect the victims of these various crimes. In that kind of case, I'm going to follow the epistemic norms. I'm going to go where rationality leads me. And my friendship with Anna, of course, is important, but it's not more important than acting rationally in my role as, say, a jury, or in my role judging the evidence. So Keller's response ultimately, right, is to say there is a genuine conflict. And what we need to do is actually come up with something called kind of like a meta norm, kind of like a way of action guiding for ourselves to figure out which norms we're going to follow in what kinds of scenarios. When do I follow my epistemic norms? When do I follow my friendship norms? And he thinks in that way, there still is going to be cases where they conflict. Nevertheless, we can live a good life, a life filled with friendship and a life filled with rationality. And we just need a way to decide for ourselves how to navigate this conflict. So yeah, does anybody have any thoughts on that? I see a couple of people in the chat like Keller's response. Keller would be really happy to hear that. Yeah, Nicole, what do you think?
Kind of like the people in the chat, like I feel like I do kind of agree. I don't think that it's necessarily like satisfying because he's the one bringing up this conflict and then saying, well, you just have to choose. But I think that it definitely is the reality of it. Like some people are gonna prefer that you just be a good friend, and maybe even if that means just being nice or sugarcoating things, that's just maybe what they want. And then in other cases, people might just want you to be like honest, even if that's going against your guys' friendship or something like that. And then again, like it's very like situational, like just in the case of like if it's murder, like yeah, you should believe the evidence. Like that's a huge
Yeah.
thing. But if it's something like poetry, maybe you would just support them, even if it might be like blindly.
Okay, good, good. So you're like, okay, I see. You sympathize. Okay, so you're like, all right, Keller, it's kind of weird that you bring up this conflict, and then you're like, just do what you feel, you know. But you see the appeal of that. Okay, all right, great. Yeah, Emma, what do you think?
I would kind of also agree with Keller in the extent of like different situations require different kind of treatment, I guess you could say. But I do think that being honest is a very important part of friendship. That is something that I also look for, like, especially if it comes to like poetry or art, I would rather get criticism and feedback to then better myself than I guess get lied to. And also to just think that friendship and criticism friendship and crit friend criticism is an important part of friendship in a way because it's how you help make each other better people.
Good, good. So what I'm hearing from you, Emma, is that now you're thinking like, okay, you know what? This is actually making me want to rethink this conflict. You're like, maybe part of what it is to be a good friend isn't to believe in them when the evidence points against it. You're like, hey, if I think about what I want from my friends, I want them to be rational people. I think that's good for my friend to be a rational person. And if the evidence points towards my poetry going to suck on Friday, then I want them to believe that, right? So what I'm thinking from you, what I'm hearing from you is that you want to resolve you want to say, actually, Keller, this conflict isn't a real conflict once we realize that being a good friend is quite unpleasant. And that's one of the views we heard also at the beginning. I forgot who raised it at the beginning of the discussion, but that's a way of resolving the conflict. And I think that's a really interesting and compelling way. So if this were a philosophy class, right, I would probably be like, Emma, go with that. I want to see that in a paper. I want to see why you think it's more important to have this kind of honesty at all costs, even when it leads to hurt feelings and painful reactions. So this is great. This is great. Anybody else want to share any thoughts on this? All right. Yes. All right. Yes. So there's great stuff in the chat here too. So I'll just read this last comment, right? Being a person and having relationships is inherently uncomfortable and unsatisfying at times. We don't always get the luxury of having a concrete answer, and that is what makes people so beautiful, I think. Yes. So that's great, right? So here the idea is that maybe what this is, if you're agreeing with Emma and Haley's insights here, right? What you might be thinking is like, hey, this maybe just makes us rethink what some of our friendship norms are, right? Maybe our friendship norm isn't to believe in our friends no matter what. Our friendship norm is to be as honest with them at all times, which is one that some people have also suggested. And we should recognize that that's going to lead to these uncomfortable moments of friendship, and that that's going to just help us understand a key aspect of the human condition, that part of what it is to have a deep, highly meaningful friendship is to be put in these kind of painful situations with regard to our friends. Yeah, Nicole, what do you think?
I honestly like agree with that, and I feel like that just goes back to the point of like it's very dependent on the person because I know that I try and be honest, even if it might like hurt some people's feelings, but it's
Yeah.
like not everyone sees that as you being a good friend. So it really comes down to what your idea of being a good friend is. Because if you believe, yeah, honesty is like the base of the friendship, then you would definitely say, okay, well, just be honest with me all the time. But some people, even if they might think like honesty is like their base of what they think is a
Right.
friendship, they might be like, okay, well, you're kind of hurting my feelings by being honest. So again,
Good.
I think it really comes down to who it is and how they feel about like friendships essentially.
Great. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that actually, even though I'm not sure you feel the same way as me about this, but that's actually one of the things I find kind of uncomfortable about something like Keller's response. Because here, right, the idea seems to be like, okay, we can just choose when to follow friendship norms, when to follow epistemic norms, and maybe even we can just choose what the proper friendship norms are. And maybe different people have different ideas of friendship norms, right? Here's one thing that makes me kind of uncomfortable about this, right? Though I agree, I think this is what Keller is thinking. So you're totally in line with it, right? But one thing that's like, well, friendship is a two-way street, right? I'm wondering if he's right about this. Are meaningful friendships that possible or that likely? Because here's what I'm questioning, right? If friendship norms are really up to us to follow, each one of us individually, then but friendship is an enterprise between multiple people, right? Then it seems like it could happen, and maybe Keller's envisioning this as happening, that different members of the friendship have radically different ideas of what the friendship norms are and when we should follow them. And what I'm worried about with Keller's response is like, is that going to be the basis of meaningful friendships? If the two friends have different ideas of what the friendship norms are and when we should follow them, then how are meaningful friendships going to be preserved in light of that kind of conflict, right? So one thing that I always wanted to hear more about from Keller, and which I think, Nicole, your question is getting at really nicely, right? Is like, okay, you're thinking that we can decide for ourselves when to follow the friendship norms, when to follow the epistemic norms. Is that something that we decide as individuals? Is that something we decide as a friendship unit? Do we do it explicitly? Do we do it implicitly? If we don't do it explicitly, how do we make sure we're being a good friend if me and the friend have different norms we're following at different times, right? So I think those are some of the like hard questions for Keller that arise once we go with his solution. All right. Okay. Okay, great. So I think this might be a good time to start to wrap things up with this, right? So I just want to recap what we've done so far, right? Is what I've done is I have told you about this kind of conflict between being a good friend and being a rational believer, being responsive to your evidence. We've looked at some initial ways to try to get around the conflict, but we saw that some of them just led to violating other norms of friendship or other epistemic norms, right? And then so we really came at the end on different people were voicing, I think, three families of views, right? One is the Keller view, which is, hey, there are epistemic norms, there are friendship norms. We have to decide for ourselves when to follow which ones and which ones to follow, right? Among those groups. There's the people that say, hey, in face of this conflict, I think really what we have to do is just always follow the rationality norm, no matter how hard it is, right? The epistemic norm. And then there's other people that say, hey, look, what's really important is that we be a good friend, even if that means acting irrationally sometimes. So really, we need to hunker down on our friendship norms. And if that means we violate our epistemic norms sometimes, so be it. Okay, and then so if this were a real class, as I said, I mean, it is a real class, but if this was a real semester-long class, we would then go on and explore the different things people have been saying and try to figure out how that reflects on your own views and how it should reflect on your views guiding your friendships and your thoughts on rationality going forward. So I think I'm gonna shut up now and just see if anybody has any lingering questions, either about this topic, about philosophy in general, about philosophy at SU, about where to get the SU mascot, etc. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, awesome. Well, we're supposed to end in 2 minutes anyway. So I'll just reiterate that this is one topic among many in philosophy that you could study. And again, this is a very personal topic about our personal friendships, but you can study all sorts of topics from, what makes a just political state to does God exist? To what are race and gender social constructs, to what is the right logic, and what are principles of critical thinking. So in a philosophy major would usually have a pretty big variety of these different types of topics. And I really love to talk with you. I thought you guys were excellent. I'm sorry I didn't get to see everything in the chat, but the comments I saw and the oral comments have been really fantastic. Any of you and all of you could easily be in my class, and I wouldn't have thought you're any different than any of our students. So I really hope to see some of you in the future, hopefully all of you. And if you have any other questions about anything philosophy related or SU related, I'm just going to put my email in the chat. It's at sear.edu. And thanks so much again. It was really great to meet all of you. Yeah. Thanks.